Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guest today is Dr. Courtney Brown, Vice President of Impact and Planning for Lumina Foundation, an independent private foundation located in Indianapolis that is committed to making opportunities for learning beyond high school available to all. As Lumina's Chief Data and Research Officer, Courtney oversees the foundation's efforts in the area of strategic planning, learning, impact, and effectiveness. She also leads Lumina's international engagement. Courtney is an expert in post-secondary strategy, student success, data-driven decision-making, and evidence-based practices. And she joins us today to talk about Lumina's most recent study on the state of higher education for 2023, breaking down the barriers to student enrollment and retention.
Courtney, welcome to the program.
Thank you. So happy to be with you.
I'm looking forward to our conversation. This is going to be a great one. But before we get into it, you're with Lumina Foundation, which has done some incredible things in higher ed. Give us a little bit about your background and how you came to Lumina.
Yeah, sure. I have been at Lumina for about 12 years, which seems like just a minute ago that I joined. I came from Lumina, actually from a university. So I was a research faculty member and did a lot of work with evaluation and research. I was evaluating programs and doing research. And I had actually done a lot of work with the Department of Education on their performance measurement system and helped them create some measurement system for their GEPRA reports, their annual reports for their grantees. And about the same time, Lumina had begun, they had launched this new goal, which I'll talk about in a minute, and they were really looking toward metrics and what kind of metrics they could hold themselves accountable to and have the nation hold itself accountable to. And so given my background in that and, my interest in exploring a new opportunity, it was the perfect marriage. So I came in and worked on creating this performance metrics system for Lumina. And you can see much of that in our Stronger Nation report and other things that we can talk about throughout the time together.
Well, that's fabulous. So I'm guessing the work that you did with the department was back during the Bush and the Obama administrations?
Yes, back then, pre-Obama times, yes.
And that was interesting because that was the first real focus on accountability and metrics in education.
Yeah, and a lot of it was really about their grant program. So how do you know somebody is being successful? What outputs and outcomes should organizations look for in understanding if the grantees are making any progress? And so that's what we are trying to capture.
And Lumina has done a fabulous job with that since you've joined and even before. Give us a little background about Lumina because some of our listeners may not know what Lumina is.
Yeah, absolutely. So Lumina was formed in about 2000, and we're a private foundation located, our headquarters are in Indianapolis, but we are a national foundation. And in 2008, we had a new CEO who came in, who's our current CEO, Jamie Marasotis, and he set a goal for the nation. And that goal is that by 2025, 60% of those people in the United States will have a post-secondary credential. And so we focus all of our efforts on achieving that goal. When Lumina set that goal in 2008, the nation was at about 38%. That's 38% of adults 25 to 64 who hold a high quality credential. Since that time, in our most recent data that we have, our 2021 data, we're now at almost 54%. So the nation has made tremendous progress over that time. And Lumina was a part of that in helping to set that agenda.
That is fabulous. I didn't realize it was as high as it is. What are some of the levers that you push at Lumina to get us up to the 60%?
Yeah, well, we really focus on a couple things. First of all, we have a foundation in racial equity. We want to ensure that more people of color, especially Blacks, Latinos, Hispanics, and Native Americans, have opportunities to not just pursue, but successfully complete a high-quality credential. We put out something every year called Stronger Nation. Stronger Nation is an online tool. It's accessible to anyone. You can Google Stronger Nation Lumina Foundation and you'll see it. And it's where we show where the nation is with attainment. We share where every state is with regards to attainment, and we break that down by race and ethnicity. And when you look at that data, you can see a troubling trend where while everyone has been increasing since that 2008 time, there's still these gaps that exist between Asians and whites on one hand and Blacks, Latinos, and Native Americans on the other hand. And so what we're really trying to do is to break down systemic barriers that students of color, low-income students, other students are facing so that they have these opportunities to successfully complete. One of the first things we did was really work to make sure that every state in the nation had their own goal, whatever made most sense for them, and so they could set a goal for their state. When we set the goal, the national goal in 2008, only Hawaii had an attainment goal. As of today, 48 states have attainment goals that they're working toward.
Wow. 48 states. That's amazing. I won't ask you who the 2 states are that don't have them.
Yeah, I'll tell you offline.
Okay. But your work with the government officials, the universities, colleges, all the above, more than that, to help increase this attainment rate?
Right. We work with policymakers, systems, institutions, intermediaries to really help change the system. We don't, do boutique, small programs. We don't offer small scholarships or anything like that. We really want to make sure that we are making sustainable change that's going to have a positive impact on everyone.
That's fascinating. Give me an example of one of the programs that you would do.
Oh, there's so many. So currently we are working on ensuring we have 3 different concentration areas. We focus on participation, enrollment, getting more people to enroll in post-secondary education. And when I say post-secondary education, I'm talking about short-term credentials. Those are certificates or certifications, as well as associate degrees and bachelor's degrees. So we want to make sure that more people are participating, enrolling. Participation is not enough, though. You have to be successful. You have to stay enrolled, persist in that. And so we have another concentration area called success, student success, and that is ensuring that students stay enrolled and that they can successfully complete a post-secondary credential. Our third concentration area is employment-aligned credentials, because we recognize that people want to get a credential because they need a job on the other end. And we recognize quality credentials by that they lead to further education and employment. So we want to make sure that there's no dead-end credential and that it actually has a value in the marketplace. And so we put a lot of efforts in making sure that there are quality credentials that institutions and organizations are providing to protect that student so they have something that's opening the door to further employment.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. I just had a guest on the program, Matt Frank, who works for Salesforce. But he has come to be an expert on credentials. And it was interesting because there are well over 1 million credentials out there. And one of the challenges is, are they relevant? Who's accrediting them? There isn't really anybody other than, maybe like the AMA, the American Medical Association, saying, we approve this credential. So it's kind of like the Wild West with credentials. Is Lumina moving into that type of accreditation of credentials?
That's a great question. When we set the goal in 2008, we said 60% by 2025, 60% would hold a high quality post-high school credential. And so that included certificates, certifications, associate degrees, and bachelor's degrees and beyond. When we set the goal, though, we could only count degrees. And since that time, we have found nationally representative data that we are able to actually measure certificate and certification attainment also, which you can see in our Stronger Nation report. So to answer your question, yes, we are absolutely in that space, but we make sure that they are high value certificates or certifications. And by that, as I said, that they are not dead-end credentials. They can lead to further education. We talk a lot about stacking nowadays in post-secondary education. So they can stack to other credentials, as well as lead to employment. That's why our focus on employment-aligned credentials is so important, because we want to make sure that they aren't, that people aren't spending lots of money and it's not leading them anywhere. We want to protect the consumer, the student.
It sounds like some of the complaints that I hear from graduates from their degrees saying they're not leading them anywhere.
I would say that a lot of that is a narrative that exists right now, that for some reason there's a narrative out there in the media that people don't value higher education, or that the credentials are not leading anywhere. Now, I'm not going to say that all are good. So there's, many credentials out there that are not high quality. And so some of the work that we do, a lot of the work we do is making sure that there are high quality credentials, that they do lead to employment. But, the data show, we see data from the Georgetown Center on Education in the Workforce, that it does, these credentials do lead to, incredible income, more than they would without a credential at all. So there is an incredible value in having these credentials.
It makes sense to me, but you're right. There is that narrative out there, especially if you're a history major or something along those lines, if you're not a STEM graduate. And we all know that that's not true, but that is the perception that's out there. And the way things are going right now with media, et cetera, if it gets printed, we know it's got to be the truth, right?
Yeah.
So that's a good background for what we're going to talk about over this podcast, and the next one is the state of higher ed. Now, Courtney, let's talk about what's going on in higher ed. You've got the studies, but before we start getting into those, let's set the stage. Higher ed's got a few challenges, doesn't it?
Higher ed does have a few challenges. Yeah, as I said, we made tremendous progress over the last 15 years with regards to attainment. Attainment is, absolutely increased, but we're not where we need to be. The system just isn't serving today's students.
That's an interesting statement. Not serving today's students. Is that from a generational perspective? Is that because of the situation we're in, all the above, more than that?
It's all the above. I think that if you were to ask most people, who is a college student? Most people would say, oh, they're 18, 19 years old. They graduated from high school and they went on to college, and they're, living somewhere on campus for 4 years, and then they're going to graduate and go get a job. And unfortunately, that could not be further from the truth. Today's students are older, they're more racially diverse, and they're facing multiple barriers. So you may be surprised to know that almost 40% of today's college students are over 25. Almost half of today's college students are first-generation college goers. So they didn't have parents or family that went to college. 42% of college students are students of color. And even more surprising, I think, to many people is that 64% of college students work. 40% of them work full-time. So they're working full-time and they're going to class.
That doesn't seem sustainable to me.
Well, it's hard. And let me add one more to it, because there are plenty more, but let me add one more. A quarter of college students have children or other dependents. So they're older, they're working full-time, they have dependents, they're facing, financial hardship all at the same time while they're trying to go to school. So we have all of that happening. And then what happened a few years ago is we got hit by a pandemic.
Really?
Surprise. And so all of these things have kind of come together to create this moment where, we'd been seeing enrollment declining for the last decade, probably, across the board. And then the pandemic hit, and it just exacerbated that incredibly steep decline. We saw it clearly with the community colleges at first, but the four-year institutions are having a slow decline, and they're not really coming back from that. They've kind of stabilized at the bottom, so they're not, hemorrhaging as much, but they are still losing students and losing, they maybe look like a small percentage, but it's a lot of students together. So when you were thinking about like who today's students are and the current situation we're under, it is problematic that we're not going to be able to have the talent we need as a country unless we address this head on.
Well, I read something just recently that enrollment has finally increased to above pre-recession levels. Since the pandemic, we've lost well over a million, if not a 1.2, 1.3 million students.
Yes.
And the enrollment is still down significantly.
Yes, we are not back to pre-pandemic levels. What's happened is we've just kind of stabilized at the bottom.
But we are starting to see some recovery. Community colleges.
Four-years, not so much. I mean, they are stabilizing, so that's good. And you know, there are many four-year institutions that haven't seen this problem. A lot of the elite institutions didn't have a problem, and they won't have a problem. But the colleges, the four-year colleges and the two-year colleges, where the majority of students in the United States go, are having enrollment crises. They are having issues getting those first-time enrollments, as well as the continued enrollment, getting people to persist. And you know, one of the reasons that this is such a crisis is that today in the United States, actually the data is a little bit old, a couple years old, but the National Student Clearinghouse put out a report last month about the some college no degree students. Some college no degree students are those students who enrolled in a two-year or four-year institution and whatever reason stopped out along the way. So they were a student, they're no longer a student, and they're not currently enrolled. Right now in the United States, that is over 40 million people. I mean, that's an insane number, that 40 million people tried to go to a two-year or four-year institution, and again, for whatever reason, had to stop out. That is about 25% of 25 to 64-year-olds. That's a lot of people.
Which, if you're an enrollment manager, director, VP at a university, those should be people you would be targeting to bring back. Am I right?
Absolutely. The Clearinghouse in their most recent report looked at those kind of near completers, those students who had, you know, a couple years already of credit under their belt, and said, you know, those are the students that are more likely to come back, and they're more likely to come back and complete. I think most of them are more likely to come back and complete a two-year credential because, you know, they're getting older and, you know, they need a credential that they can get faster, that's going to provide value in the marketplace. But there's still a third of those students who are coming back and completing bachelor's degrees. So for both two-year and four-year institutions, they need to begin to think about these over 40 million people. And unfortunately, we know that number is even higher given all the people, you know, talked about the 1.5 million were down with enrollment. So those numbers have just added to that 40 million. That was, I think that data's most recent was from 2021.
Well, and it plays directly into your statement from a little earlier about not serving today's students. These students have got different needs. You know, like you said, working full time. They're caregivers for children or even elderly parents. You know, health concerns, job concerns, all of those type of things. There's one school that I know of in Hawaii. It's one of the community colleges who got a significant grant about 6 years ago, who put in childcare facilities on campus.
Yeah.
I mean, at the time I was thinking, this is crazy. It wasn't. It was brilliant.
Absolutely. Food pantries, childcare, transportation, all of these things have a tremendous help to students today.
And with those, again, focusing on today's students, online education is a way to help, is it not?
You know, absolutely, but online education alone is not sufficient. It has to be good online education. You know, I think we learned early in the pandemic when everybody, you know, raced to try to figure out online that wasn't really working for some people, and the isolation especially was hard. And so thinking of ways to better engage with students and maybe come up with blended models where there's some synchronous, asynchronous, in person, but that connection with people and a feeling of belonging is really important to students.
Well, it's that feeling of belonging and the mental health aspects of it as well.
100%. Yes. Yeah.
So that's a good segue into talking about your latest report. This is the third one that you've done. And just reading from the executive summary, you've partnered with Gallup to conduct this third consecutive administration study to systemically understand the experiences of currently enrolled students and the attributes and beliefs about higher education among unenrolled adults including those with previous post-secondary experience?
Yeah, we started this study in the fall of 2020, in the heat of the early days of the pandemic, when everyone was trying to guess what's going to happen with students, what's going to happen with enrollment, because we know from history that during recessions, enrollment goes up, right? The jobs disappear and enrollment goes up. And so people were saying, well, maybe this is like a recession, so enrollments are going to skyrocket, or, they're going to plummet or whatever. And nobody really knew, but everyone was writing about it. And so we said, well, maybe we should ask students what they're planning on doing, or ask, people that have never enrolled. And so that's exactly what we did. In the fall of 2020, we asked, those three populations you talked about, the currently enrolled, people who had stopped out, some of those 40 million, as well as people who had never enrolled, never touched higher ed, and said, what's going on? You thinking about enrolling? What's holding you back? Are you going to stay enrolled? And, early in the pandemic, we learned that, a lot of people were unsure that they wanted to stay enrolled, or they were still thinking about enrolling, but health concerns were at the forefront. They were too worried about COVID and their families getting sick, and they had to work to, help support families and whatnot. So, it wasn't surprising, but we still saw that people valued post-secondary education then. They still wanted to come back. So we did that in the fall of 2020. And then we said, okay, well, in the fall of 2021, let's do it again, because we have a vaccine now. So what's changed? Has anything changed? And surprisingly, we still saw a large percentage of students who said they were thinking about stopping out. So this is currently enrolled, who are saying, I think I'm considering stopping out. And we said, well, why? So one of the questions was why? And while in 2020, the number one reason was health concerns, in 2021, the number one reason was emotional stress. It jumped, it almost doubled, something unreal that, you don't normally see in survey research, that emotional stress was making them think about stopping out. And that was quite amazing. And some of it, are because of these stressors we're talking about. They are working full time. They're worried about their families. They, have families. They are struggling to make ends meet. And so we did it again in the fall of 2022, and that number stayed the same, that, this high percentage of students across the board are considering stopping out because of emotional stress. So, and we learned other things too, and we can get into some of these findings about, what are the unenrolled, those who people have never enrolled saying, and what are the enrolled, what barriers are they facing also?
Well, I was pretty amazed with who you interviewed. You had a very good cross-section. Obviously, your expertise as a researcher came through on this one. Over 6,000 students who are currently enrolled, stopped out over 3,000, never enrolled over 3,000, a really good balance. And you were able to ask the tough questions of the students.
Absolutely. And we also this year followed up with qualitative data also. So if you're able to look at our report, you'll see some quotes, and even on the online, if you look at Lumina Foundation, Gallup, State of Higher Ed, we have a website where you can pull up all the reports and see some of these quotes and some of the richer information to really tell a better story.
And for those of you who are listening and tune into the show notes, we'll have those links with the show notes. So tell us a little bit about the demographics of your study.
So beyond what you just shared, the 6,000 currently enrolled and the 3,000 stopped out and the 3,000 never enrolled, we also wanted to make sure we had a good cross-section of region in the U.S., as well as race and ethnicity, to make sure that we could speak to, the Black student experience, the Latino student experience, and show different barriers that people may be facing based on age, race, gender, and those sort of things. And then we really focused on, what the unenrolled, either those people who had stopped out or never enrolled, the barriers in what they're learning or seeing, and then what the currently enrolled students are facing. And then we could disaggregate by sector also, 2-year, 4-year certification.
That's great. Please tune in next week, and we will be going over the barriers that the students talked about, as well as for what presidents, boards, and administration can do to help these students complete their degrees.
Join us next week for the conclusion of our talk with Dr. Courtney Brown to hear the results of the study and what higher ed leaders can do to enroll the 40 million students who have stopped out of higher ed.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.